Welcome into college football overtime. My name is Garrett Chapman. His name is Abe Gordon, and we got a lot to jump into this afternoon. Happy Monday, or whatever day that it is that you're watching this, because we are that much closer to college football. I think we're down to, 10 Saturdays left, Abe Gordon? Something like that. But it cannot get here soon enough. We're taking care of you all off season long as we ramp up to the 2024 college football season. So make sure you make sure you subscribe and make sure you follow along as we go through all of the big stories and news of the college football offseason. And today, we got to jump into what just happened with the NCAA settlement. We're a couple of days behind it, but at the end of the day, it's still a massive deal, and we're still a few months away from a full and total resolution. But we'll discuss where we stand right now. Plus, we want to jump into the teams who we think might be the most likely or least likely to repeat as a conference champion in the Power Four, I guess, with the end of the Pac-12 conference coming to an official end on Saturday night. But before we do all of that, gotta welcome in my co-host, Dave Gordon. How you doing, buddy?
We're doing good, man. You said it's maybe 10 Saturdays. That's about 9 too many. I'm ready to play some football, but gonna have to wait the majority of the summer to get there.
Yeah, we'll get there, and honestly, it'll be here before you know it. The off season it's brutally long, but you know what? We get through it, and we do what we got to do with it. But it's one of the things that makes it beautiful was the fact that the season's so short. It's such a short season. 12 games it doesn't feel like enough, but it's over the course of 13 weeks, and it's over and done and gone very quickly. But Abe, let's jump into some of the news that we are seeing across college football right now. The biggest one, of course, is the settlement between the NCAA and the other Power Four conferences. We're looking at an ocean of change coming to college sports. It's House versus NCAA. It must be approved by a federal judge that's overseeing the case, and that decision still could be a couple of months away. But effectively, college leaders took the best of some of the bad options. It's the end of amateurism, but we've kind of seen that coming for a very long time. But there are two key items here. First, it's going to distribute some $2.75 billion to athletes who competed before July of 2021 when the NCAA first allowed name, image, and likeness to come into the sports. And then second, it would create a future revenue sharing model in which schools could distribute upwards of $20 million directly to the athletes. Now, there are a lot of questions that still remain across this landscape right now. Like, which athletes are going to be compensated? How much are they going to make? Title IX, will the women be paid equally to men? Will schools that are unable to pay athletes be able to keep up with bigger or richer schools? There are a lot of big looming questions that are going to have to be answered. But the $20 million distribution model to athletes is still significantly lower than what you see at the professional level. Of course, that's one of the big reasons for that is because they're not collectively bargained. And I know we've talked about it on this podcast before, Abe. It's going to come to the sport eventually, but there are a ton of questions that remain with all of this. What's it going to look like in the very near future? But right now, as soon as maybe 2025, I think I read, you might be seeing all of this revenue coming into the pockets of athletes. And it was a long time coming, but it's not over yet.
Yeah, and I think people are happy that the athletes are being compensated somewhat. I don't know if we should say fairly, but compensated. But it's going to get messier before it gets cleaned up. And there's a lot of questions that are still going to be asked. Does this get rid of collectives and boosters and NIL money? And most likely the answer to that is no. And so it's still going to be a messy business. It also, I also think it actually delays the idea of conference realignment beyond what it potentially could have been in the next couple of years. It feels like we're kind of stuck in a holding pattern for a decade while this settlement is paid out. And look, this was a decision by the NCAA to settle, as opposed to going to court where it could have cost them potentially an extra, I don't know, $2.5 billion on top of the settlement. And so certainly you understand why, but I think it's going to get really ugly if we're being honest. You take a look at how the money's going to be paid out and to who. there are going to be parties that are not happy with it, quite frankly, and they're going to have to put out their formula, which is how they're deciding who gets the money and how much. It's going to get really ugly. There's going to be a lot more lawsuits, quite frankly, people who feel they're not getting their fair share of the pie. So it's going to be ugly, but it is at the same time a necessary step to, I guess, in the long term, if we're going to like really just macro it, to the survival of college football. And so it is the step that needed to be taken. There's no denying that. But it's still going to be very, very bumpy and turbulent up until they find some clear skies to get through this.
Yeah, I mean that's a consistent thing. I mean, which athletes are going to be paid? I mean that's the next big pressing question. I think, at least in the macro, like you're talking
Well,
about.
I know originally that they felt Title IX was not, it was not going to be subject to Title IX, and that
Until
there's just no way legally that's going to be allowed.
no.
And so now you're getting into percentages, and it is just going to be an ugly, ugly discussion. Again, like I said, there are going to be lawsuits on top of this based on the payments, and there's just no way to avoid it. But that's the society we live in, and rightfully so.
Yeah, I mean, and look, the lawsuits are going to be coming, and they're going to come in heavy. I mean, ultimately, it's like, do you just give it to revenue generating sports? Like, if that's some schools are going to read it differently. Some schools are going to say, hey, yeah, Title IX absolutely applies to this, and others are going to say absolutely not. And ultimately, it's going to be decided in the courts. It's going to get ugly, like you say. But one of the big topic for this as well is the fact that football coaches who have upwards of 130 players on their team. You have 85 scholarship players, 45 walk-ons. Are they going to have to start cutting players off of this roster? I mean, because you're going to have these, there are expected roster caps that are coming to college football. Players are going to be earning certain amounts of money. I mean, like, are there going to be variations for certain positions or key contributors or things of that nature? I mean, there's a lot of confusion that is going to be coming into the sport right now. And I think we got a small answer that just opened the door to several more questions that are going to be looming over the sport over here in the very near future. And it's not something that's going to be decided anytime soon. I know you talked about a lot of the realignment issues that are going on. I mean, we're looking at Florida State, maybe or maybe not getting a settlement before the season starts in August. I think it's ambitious to think that we're going to get something like that. It remains to be seen, of course. But the fact that all of this conversation is centered around off the field issues throughout the course of this offseason, and we're looking at one of the most transcendent off seasons in recent memory, or probably in the history of the sport. And this was one of the largest settlements that we've seen. This is one of the largest decisions that we've seen come down. And the NCAA, they open the door to a number of different problems and question marks that are going to be coming up and that they'll have to address here in the next year and a half or so. But let's move into some more on the field stuff, if you don't mind, Abe. Teams that are most likely to repeat as a conference champion. So if we roll through these, the reigning Power 5 conference champions, we have Texas, we have Washington, we have Alabama, Michigan, and we have Florida State. Now, there is a caveat because two of these teams no longer play for their previous power conference, right? So you have Texas, who's moving over from the Big 12, and you have Washington, who left the now defunct Pac-12, who played in their, well, I mean, it was the last ever event happened on Saturday in a walk-off style in the baseball tournament, which is pretty awesome to see. But let's start with these two teams who are moving out of their conference. So I'm going to consider them as repeat conference champions. Just means that they're going to win the SEC. So Texas is going to go to the SEC. Washington's going to win the Big Ten. So let's just say it for the sake of this discussion. But we'll start with Texas. And I'm going to say why they will, why they won't, and who is their biggest competition. What do you say about that, Abe?
Sure.
Let's do it. All right. So let's go to this. Let's start with Texas. And I'm going to say why they will repeat as conference champions. And I think it starts and ends with the quarterback, Quinn Ewers. He is as good as they come in college football. I think he's going to be one of the top players in this sport in 2024. And of course, he missed a few games last year due to injury. I hope that he can play this entire season healthy because you saw what they were able to do with him under center. And look, they still made a run at the college football playoff national title. They had a very good opportunity to take down Washington, just came down to the final plays of that game. And Quinn Ewers is back. Quinn Ewers is going to be as good as anybody in the country. And Quinn Ewers is going to be the biggest reason why they're going to be competing for not just an SEC championship, but a chance to go play for a national championship in the newly constructed 12-team playoff. On top of that, you have the quarterback position, check. But then Steve Sarkisian has consistently recruited at a high level, and not just at the skill positions like they had in the past. They have the offensive line set up. Look, it's one of the best offensive lines in the sport, and they're going to have to replace some talent, A.D. Mitchell and Xavier Worthy and Jonathan Brooks. But Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, Silas Bolden, Amari Niplak, they join an offense that was already well positioned to win. And I think they're going to be just as good on offense skill-wise as they were last year. There's not going to be a significant drop-off there. I think they're going to be strong. They're going to be one of the best teams in the SEC, and they'll have a fantastic opportunity to go win an SEC title. What say you?
Yeah, the other aspect is considering a jump into the SEC, their schedule's actually quite favorable. They get Georgia at home. They get Florida at home. Their road games are Vanderbilt, Arkansas. They are going to have to play Texas A&M. Obviously, you've got Oklahoma. But quite honestly, it's not the toughest SEC schedule that I've ever seen. And you're going to have to deal with Georgia, and whether that's at home or not, I mean, it's still Georgia. But yeah, look, I agree with you. I think when you return a quarterback that is discussed in Heisman territory, that is discussed in top 15, top 10, top 5 picks of the NFL draft, potentially, I think you're off to a good start. And look, you've got a head coach that understands the SEC. Steve Sarkisian has been in it. I think that certainly probably does help the transition a little bit. But then, yeah, the other aspect of this is just the schedule. It really is manageable for them. And so, quite frankly, if I had to tell you right now, the winner of that October 19th game between Georgia and Texas is probably the winner of the SEC. I really do think Texas comes in that strong, and it might come down to that one game as to who wins this conference, and for whatever it matters, they get it at home. And so, I do think it shapes up for Texas. Whether they win or not, it certainly shapes up for them to make a serious run at winning a new conference in their first season.
I think you're right. I mean, look, this is going to be they're one of the most likely teams in college football to repeat as a conference champion. I'll just say it that way. I think they're the most likely of those Power 5. They're really good, and they're going to have a really good opportunity, even though they're playing in a brand new conference. But I will say this. You talked about Georgia and Texas squaring off in Austin next year. I think it's not only just one of the most anticipated matchups of the season, it's one of the most anticipated matchups of the last couple of years, but it's also a preview of the SEC title race, because for those listening or watching right now who may not remember, it's the fact that the SEC is doing away with divisions, completely and totally doing away with them. So all you have to do is finish in the top 2, and you have a chance to go play for an SEC championship. Well, I think Texas and Georgia are both going to be very well positioned to do just that, and pretty much run the table outside of a handful of matchups that they'll have that are going to be very difficult, including Georgia at Texas. So that's going to be a really tough one. I think it's going to be a preview of the SEC title game, because I think they're the 2 best teams in the SEC next year. But ultimately, let's talk about why they won't do it. And I think, really, you're in a new conference. Welcome to the SEC, my friend, because gone are Iowa State and Kansas State and all of these other programs, Texas Tech. All due respect to them, you're trading those teams for much stiffer competition. You're trading them for LSU and for Ole Miss and for Georgia, for Alabama, for Tennessee. Missouri is going to be very strong this year. There are a ton of competent football teams in the SEC. Not saying that they're not competent in the Big 12, but you saw what Georgia did to TCU in the national title game last year, or 2 years ago. Kansas State is a respectable program. Oklahoma, of course, is joining you in the SEC, and Oklahoma's dominated that conference for a very good reason. It's because the difference between the top teams and the middle teams and the bottom teams in the conference is much more stark than it is in the SEC. And that's going to take a little bit of time to adjust to. I think Steve Sarkisian is the best coach to do it. I think it's not quite as pronounced as a lot of SEC fans like to think it is, but it is still going to be pretty consistent. The day in, day out grind of being in the SEC is far more significant than any other conference. And I think Texas is going to have their work cut out for them, despite the fact that they may have one of the easier schedules by SEC standards. It's still a much tougher schedule for Texas than what they've played at any point in the recent past.
Yeah, I to be honest, I completely disagree with everything you've just said. And now over the course of time, I think you're right, but they don't play Alabama, they don't play LSU, they don't play Tennessee, they don't play Missouri, they don't play Ole Miss. These bugaboo games where you need to bring your best every week is not on the schedule. Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, Florida, Kentucky, I'm sorry, they don't have to play their best. And again, over the course of time, I absolutely agree with you. The week in, week out, but it just sets up in year one where I don't know if that's a discussion. That being said, the biggest reason that they're not likely to repeat as a conference champion is quite frankly the Georgia Bulldogs, who I just think are again returning the best team in the country. And it's nothing against Texas. I just think they're it's going to be very difficult. That being said, they do get that heads up game. They do get it at home, and so we'll see. But yeah, I don't know, man. Like the more I look at the schedule, the more I'm kind of with you in terms of even if they lose that game to Georgia, they might be rematching in the SEC title game. It would take a surprise when I look at their schedule. It would take I would be kind of surprised to not see them sitting there at worst 10-2 at worst.
Well, one of the other things that Texas has done a couple of times over the last few years is they fall asleep at the wheel once or twice a year. And like you can look at what they did against TCU this year, 29-26 in that one. I mean, they almost fell to Kansas State, 33-30 in that one. They almost fall to Iowa State. They only win that one by, I think it's 10 points in that one against a far inferior opponent. All I'm trying to say when I'm trying to see the schedule gets up a little bit, I'm not saying that they have to play the best teams in the conference. It's just the room for error is much smaller in this conference now. And Kentucky's a better program than many of those guys. You know, I'm like, they're going to be a fine team next year. But to your point and to your credit, Texas is good, should be favored in just about every game that they play, except for that game against Georgia, where they're going to be a home underdog, which they absolutely will be. And you're exactly right. The number one reason why they're not going to win the SEC next year is the University of Georgia. They're the best team in the conference. They've won 2 of the last 3 national championships for a reason. And not to mention the fact that you also have an Alabama Crimson Tide in the conference. Everybody else is going to be very strong. And the competition is going to be stiff. And that's all I'm saying. It's not that they're going to be playing them heads up. It's that they're going to have to be scoreboard watching a good bit throughout the course of the season. And I think Texas, again, I'll say it again. I think they're the most likely of the teams to repeat as conference champions. I think a lot of the SEC team, the SEC homers they've overplayed the welcome to the SEC just a little bit. Texas is going to have they'll go through their lumps over the next few years, but ultimately Texas is still Texas and they're going to be just fine. So we go from what I think is the most likely team to repeat as a conference champion to who I think is the least likely team to repeat as a conference champion, the Washington Huskies. They played for a national title last year in Kalen DeBoer's final season, Michael Penix's final season, Rowan Dunze's final season, and Jalen McMillan's final season. And if you're not getting picking up what I'm putting down, it's the fact that their entire roster is gone from last year. They have to replace a ton of talent. And look, on top of that, you have to move into the Big Ten with a new conference with intense travel requirements. And we talk about the uptick in schedule. Well, you're trading the Pac-12, who I think was probably the most competitive conference in college football last year, to Now you get the Michigans and the Ohio States, and you keep a lot of those same Big Ten teams like an Oregon and a USC. So it's going to be very difficult for Washington. I think the chances that they do, it's because Jed Fish has a very competent quarterback in Will Rogers under center. I don't know if that's going to be enough. I don't think that's what's going to be the case. But I mean, ultimately, or excuse me, I got that incorrect. Will Rogers is going to. Oh no, he is. He is at Washington. For a split second, I was like, did he go to Washington State? No, but he's going to be under center for them in 2024, and I think ultimately it's going to be a tough one for Washington. They're devoid of talent. They're going into a conference where they're not beating Ohio State. They're not going to beat out a USC next year. I don't think they're not going to beat out Oregon. It's going to be very, very difficult for the Huskies.
Yeah, I agree. I know they've done as much as they can with transfers, but they're dealing with moving conferences, changing coaches, and the schedule is just so much more brutal than it was. And so, I'm with you. I just think it's a lot to ask. Now they do get to avoid Ohio State in this one, but they still have matches on the road against Iowa. They still play USC. They still play at Penn State. They still play Oregon. So it's still going to be very, very tough to see them with, I mean, what, 2, maybe 3 conference losses in an ideal situation.
Yeah, and look, at the end of the day, it's like you may avoid Ohio State in the buildup, but then you'd have to play them in the conference championship regardless. So it just seems like they got their work cut out for them. I just don't see a path for them forward. I mean, we're looking at a likely maybe 7-win season for them. It's going to be a snap back to reality pretty quickly for the Washington Huskies, which they came very close last year. They played in a national title game with Michael Penix and company, and they were a great team, fun team to watch. And Kalen DeBoer losing him ultimately is going to be the nail in the coffin for this program for the next few years. I like Jed Fish a lot. I think he's going to elevate the program at least to or hold water at least over there at Washington. He did a very good job at Arizona. We'll see what he ends up doing over there as they move into the Big Ten Conference. But again, I'll say it again. The least likely team, in my opinion, to repeat as conference champions as they move into the Big Ten. Next up, the SEC champion. So we're actually going to get into teams who won the conference that they are still in. The Alabama Crimson Tide. Of course, they have the brand new head coach and Kalen DeBoer after losing Nick Saban to retirement. I think he has his most talented team that he has ever coached at the college level. And that's saying something. He played in a national championship he coached in a national championship last year. Now he's got a Jalen Milroe who's back under center, along with several key contributors on both offense and defense. Alabama is as talented as they come. And look, at the end, they also don't have to run through the SEC West next season. So you have the newly shaped SEC conferences, and at the end of all of that, all they have to do is run their table, which is pretty difficult. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But as far as why they will win the conference, it comes down to Kalen DeBoer and Jalen Milroe. I think that combination is going to be potent. I think they are going to be in every game that they play this year, and they should be favored in just about all of them. But look, at the end of the day, the schedule is tough. Abe, what do you think?
Yeah, the tough thing for them is they're competing, and it because there's no longer conferences, or excuse me, divisions. It actually works against them. And what I mean by that is it's not all in front of them who they play, and having heads up. They've got to deal with the potential of Georgia having 1 or no conference losses, and Texas having 1, maybe none, or even 2 conference losses. And Alabama's schedule is difficult. There's a stretch here in mid to late October into November where they're playing at Tennessee, home against Missouri, at LSU. And look, if Texas's only SEC loss is Georgia, Alabama's going to have to run that table because they also play Georgia. Yeah. And so it's going to be incredibly, incredibly important for them to not have any of those drop-offs, to have any room for error. But look, I mean, it's all going to come down to the new head coach there, Kalen DeBoer, and what he can do with Jalen Milroe, like you mentioned. I don't know if I would go as far as to say it's his most talented team. I think that Washington squad last year was pretty high up there as well. So it'll be interesting to see. But they've got to get that defense ramped up. I trust he'll be able to handle the offense and what he's bringing from Washington, but they have got to get the defense to be a little bit more impactful than they were a year ago.
Yeah, and to that talent thing, I think Alabama's super talented. They have been for years, and that composite's going to be, if you believe in that sort of thing, the talent composite on 24/7 Sports has them as one of the most talented teams in the country. However, the margins have decreased significantly in the last couple of years. I don't think that's Nick Saban falling off necessarily. I think it's just the fact that the rest of the country, like the likes of Georgia and Ohio States and everybody else, they're in Texas, they're recruiting at a high level too. And recruiting has turned into a very national type of thing. And a lot of other big name brands are coming in, and smaller teams are picking up talented players too because of the additions of name, image, and likeness and everything else. So I think the margins are a lot smaller for Alabama than they used to be. They should still have an advantage in every game that they play for the most part. But what happens if and when they lose? I think that's really the biggest thing, because you have Kalen DeBoer coming in and he's completely different than Nick Saban. And I don't want him to come in and be Nick Saban because he's not that. I mean, he's a completely different persona. He's much different with the media. It's not exactly lock and key. You've already seen the media coming in and watching practices, and they made a huge deal about that when they actually were able to come out on the field and interact with people during the practices. The music is bumping during practice, and people are interacting differently, and people are having a little bit more fun. It's not quite as lock and key as it was under Nick Saban. So what happens if and when they lose? Are you going to have noise from the outside? How do they deal with that sort of pressure? Kalen DeBoer is not somebody who's used to losing. He hasn't really lost at the collegiate level. He won multiple national championships before making the jump to Division I. And outside of his first season at Washington, he's done almost nothing but win. And what happens when you drop some of these losable games? I mean, you're Wisconsin, UGA, Tennessee, Missouri, LSU, Auburn, Oklahoma. You're not going undefeated in that stretch. I think it's not if, it's when they lose a game. And then you're going to have all of the outside noise, all of the boosters coming up and saying, how much patience are they really going to have? This is a program, and I think it's pretty self-explanatory, but it's the most spoiled fan base in college football because you've won double-digit games for almost 20 years. I mean, it's been an unprecedented run of excellence over there in Tuscaloosa. So what happens when you start losing? I think it's good. It's a fair question.
I think you're greatly overstating it, to be honest.
I might be. It's year one.
Yeah, I think they're going to be a lot more understanding of the first year for Kalen DeBoer. I don't think it's championship or bust the way it was with Saban. So I don't think the boosters are coming to him the moment they have year two and they're like, hey, what the heck's going on? I don't think it's going to be anything like that. In terms of outsized noise, I don't think that's any different than it has been in years past.
Sure.
Quite frankly, I mean, they're it's not like because Saban kept the media out, no one criticized Saban, I just a little too strong on that. I just think that I think it is going to be a slow ramp up period for Kalen DeBoer, and I think that's going to be allowed and understanding. Now the difference is if you have too big of a step back, that is probably more so in the fact. But if you're 8-4, 9-3 in year one, I think that will be allowable. Now, I'm not saying everyone's going to be happy with it, but I think it'll be somewhat understood. But you can't be, 5-7, 6-6. But a little step back to kind of set your base and then get moving forward again. I think that will be somewhat understood.
Easier said than done. That's all I'm saying. I mean, this is a team that hasn't lost 3 conference games or three regular season games since 2007, and that's a really long time. And so I think that there's going to be this angst that exists within the fan base, and it's going to be felt there at least early. And
I think it depends who you lose to and how it looks.
Of course,
that's the other. Like if you're losing to Georgia and Texas, well, I don't know. They don't play Texas, but
Tennessee,
Missouri. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends who you lose to.
LSU, Auburn. I mean, there were a lot of losable games on the schedule, and I mean, if you drop 4 games next year, if you go 8-4, I'm not saying that that's what they're going to do, but it's like if you go 8-4, you cannot possibly tell me that nobody's going to be in that locker room saying we made a mistake. It's going to happen because
I don't think
that's
anyone's
just
going to be in the locker room saying it.
okay. Not okay. Outside of the locker room, like
I'm
looking into, like I'm talking boosters, fans, high level people, just in that just in general. It's just I'm interested. I'm interested. But I mean, look, they've lost a good bit. Just losing Nick Saban's a big deal, and they were always going to take us at least some sort of a step back. We'll just see how big of one it is. I think Kalen DeBoer is a splendid coach, and I think he's going to come in and do a fantastic job over there in Tuscaloosa. They're going to be a really good team next year. They should be favored in just about every game they play, outside of maybe like the Georgias and the games like that. But we'll see what they end up doing. But I'm very interested in what the Alabama Crimson Tide do in 2024, needless to say. Let's head up north. The team up north, Michigan. I think this is another one of those teams. It's going to be difficult in 2024, but I think they're just similar to Washington. They've lost just about everything. They've lost their head coach. They lost their quarterback, their running back, their wide receivers, much of their defense. But we'll get a good look at them in week 2. Texas comes up to the big house. That's going to be a very difficult game where they're breaking in a brand new roster. And that's going to be very interesting for them. But as far as why they will, I think they're still going to be strong along the defensive line. And the rushing attack is going to be, I'd say, among the very best in college football. I mean, Sherrone Moore, he likes to smash. And I think they're going to be doing just fine there. Donovan Edwards, of course, is back. You lose Blake Corum, but sophomores Benjamin Hall, Cole Cabana, and Jordan Marshall, they're all there. The room is deep. They have a ton of talent. And one thing that Michigan will do very well in 2024 is establish a rushing attack. A lot of teams are going to have trouble stopping it. I mean, we've seen what they're able to do in the past. I mean, we saw what they did last year against Penn State. They ran the ball how many times in a row? Like 30 times in a row or something crazy like that. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but they like to establish the rushing attack, and Sherrone Moore is going to do that in 2024. I think they should have a good opportunity to win every game they play, except for the likes of Ohio State and then maybe USC whenever they come to town, and Texas when they come to town. So it's going to be tough, but they should be able to have a firm identity. That's something that I can't really say for Washington, but they'll run the ball well, and I think that's going to be good. And then the defense is going to be strong.
You know, I also wondered if teams kind of would overlook Michigan. I mean, we've kind of buried them already just by the fact of how much talent they have lost to the draft this past year specifically. And teams are kind of, oh, they'll come back. Yeah, it's a new coach, and they don't have the talent and all that stuff. But I do agree with you. The one problem is they don't really have any opportunity to a slow ramp up and development. Like, they start with Fresno State in week 1, which even that game's dangerous. But then they immediately turn around and play Texas and then USC 2 weeks later. So 3 of these first 4 games are going to be very difficult. They don't have the ability to find themselves, to determine their identity. They better know, as you mentioned, what they're doing from game 1, and that is likely leaning on the run game. It's going to be very difficult, but I do wonder if people are kind of looking past Michigan and kind of burying them prematurely just because it's a new coach and because there is a turnover in talent. But we've seen that from other programs as well, and they've been able to sustain. So I wonder if Michigan maybe will surprise people a little bit with how much they can stay competitive.
Yeah, and I think there might be a little bit of a hangover after finally breaking through and winning a national championship, and that Michigan versus the world kind of mentality. I mean, we've seen other teams try to do that, and one of the realities of doing something like that is that you run out of steam, and when you are consistently going 100% and everything that you're dealing with, especially with all the off-field issues that are still present with the Michigan Wolverines, at some point, you're going to break. And I don't know when it's going to happen. I mean, the schedule, like you said, I mean, like week 2 is against Texas. You have USC in week 4. Then you have to go out to Washington, you have Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan State. I mean, like you have some games on this schedule where you might trip up. And that's not even talking about Ohio State, whose entire identity this season is based and predicated around beating you. That's it. And I think Ohio State's going to come in and throw everything that they have. against Michigan, and that's going to be a really fun game that everybody is circled on the calendar. Oh, they're circled every year because it's the game. But the way that Ohio State's retooled and the way that Ohio State's building their roster right now, you're not getting through them. I really just don't think you will. You're not going to, I have no confidence that you're going to beat them 4 years in a row. Plus, you have the new additions like Oregon. I think Penn State might finally have a chance to break through and take that next step and at least jump into the playoff conversation. Maybe or maybe not win the Big Ten or get into that sort of discussion. I think it's really going to come down to Ohio State and Oregon. But USC's right there too. And I think that you've got a lot of difficult teams who are standing in your way. And I just don't know if just leaning into the rushing attack and dominant defense is enough to get it done, even in a Big Ten conference that I think is winnable. But Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon State, USC, like behind those teams, it's going to be a tough sled for the Michigan Wolverines. And then our final one here, the Florida State, just Florida State. Look, I think DJU, he's going to help come in and mitigate the loss of Jordan Travis. Of course, you saw what they did last year when they fell off in a little bit of a way. They still won every game that they played in the regular season. They were unconquered, as they like to call themselves, 13-0. Well, 13-1 if you include the Orange Bowl. The defense is going to be strong. They've got a sterling secondary. They did lose a lot of talent to the NFL draft, but I think we're going to learn a lot about this team, especially the secondary when they play Georgia Tech in Dublin, Ireland, week 0. Because, look, Haynes King and company, they're one of the top passing attacks returning to the ACC. It's not going to be an easy matchup for them by any means, but look, Florida State's going to be very talented. I think they have a lot of key contributors they have to replace. You have 2 6'4" plus wide receivers on the outside that you're going to have to find out what you're going to do. You're replacing a rushing attack that was pretty solid last year, and Jordan Travis, of course, is the biggest of them all. But ultimately, I think it comes down to, can you get past Clemson? I mean, this is a team that you have struggled mightily to get past. And I mean, even if you get past them in the regular season, then at the next level, you'd have to beat them a second time likely. And they've struggled with the Clemson Tigers. I mean, they lost 7 straight to them before finally breaking through and winning last year. And ultimately, I say what you will, that's a game that they probably shouldn't have won last year. You have the missed field goals and the weird situations at the end of that game. And ultimately, I mean, Clemson's going to be tough for them to get by again this year. But Florida State, I think they're a good little team. They're going to come in and get it, and they'll have a great chance of making the college football playoff. And I didn't mean to say good little team. That sounded very belittling, but that's not what I meant to say. But look, Florida State's going to be a good program, and I think they'll have as good a chance as anybody to repeat as a conference champion. But it's going to be tough sledding if you're going to get through the likes of Miami and Florida and Clemson.
Yeah, I think you're underselling it again. I think they have the best chance of any team we've talked about to repeat as conference champion. And it quite frankly, it has to do with, I'm not scared of Clemson, and I'm not scared of Miami or Wake Forest or Louisville or NC State. When I look at the ACC, and it's less even about Florida State than it is who else is coming here to grab that mantle. I mean, Clemson, in my opinion, is going the wrong direction. And yes, Miami's going to try and bridge that gap as well. I understand that. But yeah, I just don't look at anyone else and be like, man, that's the team to beat. Florida State's still the team to beat in this conference. And can other teams jump up and surprise and maybe grab games here and there? Yes. But over the course of the season, it just feels like they're the most talented in this conference. And we'll see. A lot of it does come down to DJU and what exactly is he? Is he the guy that bombed out of the ACC the first time? Is he a guy that maybe solidified himself a little bit in the Pac-12? Although I wasn't overly impressed by what he did there either. I know others have higher thoughts on his accomplishments at Oregon State. But is this a guy who's now viewing his last chance to make a run as an NFL quarterback here at Florida State? And he's got to impress people. And so, yeah, I just, to me, it's more about like, when we talked about all the other teams, they were like defined other stumbling blocks in terms of who they'd have to beat to win the title, right? Whether it's Ohio State for the Michigans and the Washingtons, whether it's Georgia for the Alabamas and the Texases, there's not that team that we're pinpointing here. So When I look at that, I just look at Florida State. They lost some. Absolutely, they're going to have to replace it. But I'm not sure they've lost as much as some of these other teams. And again, I'm just not scared of anyone else in that conference.
I mean, I just disagree. I mean, there's a mental block against Clemson. I don't think you fully broke through that last year. I mean, you did get the win, of course, but I'm still I have a hard time believing that you're just going to run over a Clemson team. And
Well,
I
I'm
don't
just
think
not
that's going to
claiming a
happen.
mental block as a stumbling. Like I just
It's a
don't. I
stumbling
don't.
block, but then you have Miami, and then you have Notre Dame. Like there are 3 losses that I can see, I can point to on the schedule potentially. I mean,
I
at least
guess
3.
like I have no reason to believe those teams are going to be any good. Notre
That's
Dame,
fair. I mean,
sure. Notre Dame, sure. Like
Notre Dame's gonna
Miami,
be good.
I
Miami's
haven't
gonna be
seen
fine. With
anything out
Cam
of
Ward and
Miami
company?
that makes
No,
me.
I think they'll be
I
fine.
haven't. Cam Ward hasn't shown me anything. He
What has
got off to a
DJU
fast
shown you?
start and disappeared. Absolutely disappeared the last 8 games of last year. He
Yeah,
got off to a great
Washington
start.
State. He did, and look, Washington State fell off the map, and I don't lay that at Cam Ward's feet necessarily. They were asking him to do what Cam Newton did effectively when he was at Auburn in 2010. I mean, it's you can't just be Superman every single week,
I've
but
also just heard that the U is back every single
it's
year,
true. It's
and
true.
it's like, oh, De'Aaron King's gonna come in. The U is back. I'm like, no, man, like
Relax.
they're not. It's just like
Yeah,
every so that's part of that. That's not Cam Ward's fault, but like
no,
I've also
but
just heard that, and I'm like, okay, man, like whatever.
it's just like I've seen this about 70 million times too many, but to really believe that they're going to be the kings of the ACC. I mean, like people said they were going to be the kings of the ACC the moment they came into the conference, and I don't know
Yeah,
if they've ever won a conference championship. I think they played for one. It was Mark Richt, they got boat raced by Clemson. But I think it really comes down to the fact that I just don't really. You say Cam Ward, I don't know how much I believe in DJU.
I totally agree with that too. Yeah,
I don't think that he's the guy. I mean, like you're replacing a guy in Jordan Travis who was the model of consistency, who was the linchpin, the cornerstone of that team, and you lose him, and you saw what the team was down the stretch. They weren't that good without him. I mean, they were fine. They weren't a national championship contender without him. And look, I'm not trying to rehash this college football playoff debate that was raging for months, but how good were they? The eye test said that they weren't very good. And you're still having to replace that talent. You're bringing in a DJ Uyunglele who is strong at Clemson as a reserve player, but then as soon as he came in, he wasn't all that great. And then he goes out to Oregon State. He was fine. Like he was good. Like, but he wasn't that next level talent that he was advertised as at Clemson. He still hasn't delivered on that talent. And to your point, this is really his last opportunity to do that. This is it. So maybe we see something from him that we haven't seen yet, but I have seen very little in his track record to suggest that he's going to take that next step. And until he proves otherwise, I'm not going to believe in Florida State at that level. And to say that they're the most likely, comparing them to a Texas and Quinn Ewers, I just don't see
no,
how
no,
that's
I'm
the case.
comparing their opponents.
Sure. No, I
It's
get
not
that.
about them. They're not going to go heads up with Alabama, Georgia, or Texas. But
No.
to me, it's just more about who else is going to jump here and grab the ACC mantle. I don't really have belief in anyone, so why not
Well,
just leave it where it stands?
and Abe, I'm just going to say it here. They're going to lose some game that they're not supposed to lose next year, whether that's Georgia Tech or Boston College or somebody on this schedule. They are going to drop one of those games. And then they're also going to lose to Notre Dame. And then I think they're going to lose to Clemson. And I think ultimately when it comes down to it, I mean, of course, that's months away, but they will drop one of those games, at least one. And then I think that I don't see how they beat Notre Dame, but ultimately I think it's going to be very interesting. The ACC is ripe for the taking. There are a lot of programs in that conference who I think have a decent chance of really making some noise. And of course, you have the reshaped conference with SMU, Stanford, all these other programs that have made the leap over. Which Florida State's playing an ACC game in California next year, which is strange. But we'll see what ends up happening with Florida State. I think it's going to be very interesting. I'm asking you if you think that who do you think is the most likely person to repeat as a conference champion? Drop a comment below. Let us know who you think it would be. Then drop a follow, give us a like. Tell us what we should talk about next, as we are, I think, under 10 weeks away I want to say it's 10 weeks. I'm bought in on that one from the regular season kicking off again. Speaking of Florida State and Georgia Tech and Dublin, Ireland, week 0. It'll be here before you know it, and we will keep you company all off season long. We are the College Football Overtime Podcast, episode 50, if you can believe it, Abe Gordon. And here's to 50 more right here on the College Football Overtime Podcast. Make sure to drop a like, subscribe, follow along all off season long as we keep you company. But thank you so much for listening. My name is Garrett for Abe Gordon. We are College Football Overtime. We will see you again right here next week.